And it's a real pleasure to be here today, and there's such a big audience out there. I suppose, in addition to the professional side of things, it's probably worth mentioning that at least one member, probably two members of my family, also suffered traumatic brain injuries, and so I have a bit of experience and understanding of the impact that can have on families and friends and the systems around them. So, yes, today our objectives, I'm going to give a very brief uh, information relating to neuroanatomy and neurodevelopment, which I think are simple to understand and give a good sort of grounding for the topic we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a bit about the role of frontal lobes in daily life, what kind of tasks they're involved with, what skills are involved, and then specifically focus a bit on recognizing executive functioning difficulties following traumatic brain injury, how that affects people, what it looks like, and towards the end, a little bit of information about some strategies that we use in neurorehabilitation with a focus on compensatory strategies rather than remediation type strategies. So this is a very quick run through. We've got about 28 minutes left. I may waffle on a bit at times, but hopefully it'll give you a good basic understanding of the topic, and you can ask some questions later. So always good to start with a diagram. So here in the right is a side-on pictorial representation of your brains. Your brain is about the size of your two fists put together and is in two halves. The left half, as you probably will have known, controls the right-hand side of our body, and the right-hand side of your brain controls the opposite side of our body. The cortex, the wrinkly bit that you see in all these pictures, is divided into four regions, which we call the lobes. At the back of your head, there are the occipital lobes, primarily associated with vision, a very important sensory process for humans. Above that, the parietal lobe, which deals with touch, spatial relations, how we position ourselves in reality. To the sides, as indicated by the name temporal lobe, we have the region associated with hearing, and also particularly implicated in memory consolidation and retrieval. And then at the front, you can see probably, the biggest lobe. The bottom picture is from above looking down. You can see the large area that the frontal lobe covers from the front of your forehead to about the middle of your skull. So the frontal lobes are particularly well developed in humans compared to all other mammals. It's the bit that sort of differentiates us from other creatures and is involved in some of the higher level functions that we're able to do. It's continually developing through adolescence, and is actually the last bit to fully develop, not until maybe your mid-20s. So anybody who has any adolescents at home will understand maybe at the end of the talk how they're lacking some of the executive skills that are important in human behavior. So next slide. So yes, here's just a pictorial representation in the top left-hand corner of our evolutionary development from Australopithecus to Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, and ultimately Homo sapien, which sort of shows you how our skull has grown to develop to accommodate our brain, which has grown through evolution. And the angle shows you in particular how the frontal region has developed over evolutionary processes. And you can see in the pictures below how, our straight forehead compares, quite significantly differently to the forehead of our nearest relatives, chimpanzees. And that, the frontal lobes are certainly, an area which are significantly more developed for humans and an important part of what makes us who we are. Okay. So in terms of frontal lobe functioning, I suppose, one of the most important areas to consider first is with respects to motor function. And at the back of the frontal lobe, there is the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. This is a strip of brain where particular parts are associated with the movement of particular parts of the body. And there's on the bottom right-hand side, you can see a picture of a homunculus. This is essentially describes how our brain really sees our body, with a lot of focus on hands and our mouths and our sensory organs compared to maybe our arms, our trunks, and our legs and feet. Neuropsychologists' favorite fun fact here is that you will notice that the region related to genitalia is right next to the region related to our feet and toes, and this is what we think causes the fairly high predominance of foot fetishes amongst the sexual bodily fetishes. It's because those two regions are very close to each other, as opposed to perhaps other regions like eyes or nose region. So movement, that is, the first important part of one of the tasks of the frontal lobes. Moving further forward, there's a small area called Broca's area. This is related to speech production. It's in a double dissociation with another area further back in the brain called Wernicke's area, which is speech recognition. And they're independently, they work independently. So you can have good functioning speech recognition while at the same time having impaired expression if you have a lesion or damage to Broca's area, and vice versa. I mean, that's a whole other topic, and probably not something we have time to explore in particular detail here, but certainly an important function of the frontal lobe. Then beyond the motor cortex, premotor cortex, we have an area which is probably the focus of what we're talking about today, and that's the prefrontal cortex, right at the front of our brains. This is a large area which is often considered the control center of our brains, the area where information from all other parts of our brains is integrated and made sense of. It's also sort of a conductor here. That's a metaphor I like to consider in trying to make sense of the role of that prefrontal cortex in organizing and putting together all the information that comes in through the sensory parts of the brain, integrating it into information we're able to help ourselves orient ourselves in time and place. So the executive functions, what are they? It sounds a bit weird. Executive functions, go beyond pure memory or, pure attention or language, and is really involved in, putting together, planning, organizing, problem solving, those high order processes that, distinguish us from other mammals. Our ability to abstractly take information and to use that information to solve problems in other areas. Our ability to time travel, not literally, of course, but in our heads allows us to go back in time, consider things that have happened, or project forward into the future and consider what might happen in certain circumstances if we choose one particular path or another. It helps us to put together rules in particularly within social behavior, make sense of very complicated social worlds that we have built through our evolution. And I suppose another key area is the ability for us to initiate and inhibit instinctual behaviors, something that other mammals don't do to such a great degree. You know, I'm sure we've all seen David Attenborough programs where in the background the animals are copulating without any shame or concern that they're being filmed. You know, animals tend to directly on their instincts. You know, my dog is often, when it becomes sexually aroused, will, you know, mimic sexual behavior without considering, you know, whether that particular time and place is appropriate. They're sort of free of that need to inhibit behavior in that way. For those people who have any knowledge around Freud and his theories, I suppose the prefrontal cortex is most closely associated with our superego, an area where we make moral decisions on course of action we take. And I guess, you know, the other point about the frontal lobe, it is right here, right at the front. It is the main area that often gets hit in a trauma, particularly in car accidents, but, you know, also in assaults. It's right there at the front of what we're doing, and so is regularly the area that is likely to be involved in a traumatic brain injury, and either through, you know, direct trauma or contra coup injury, where the brain is shaken in the head, rubbing up against the rough front surface of the skull, causing tears and lesions and axonal injury. So it's, you know, it's vulnerable. It's absolutely vital. It's the bit that differentiates us from other animals, and the tasks it's involved in are complicated and multifactorial. So it's, you know, certainly leads to some interesting and, you know, not always straightforward presentations. Okay, next. So yeah, the information I've showed you so far regarding, you know, the various different lobes of the brain, these are what we call the cortical regions of the brain, the sort of the, you know, the wrinkly bifurcated apple that you consider when you think about a brain. That is exactly what you think about. But a much older region of the brain, the subcortical region, the limbic system. This is associated with, you know, more primitive, basic instincts. It's the area where more automatic processes are controlled. Your heart rate, your breathing tempo, your various control of the systems within your body generally is done through unconscious control, through reflexes, instincts that are managed outside of our consciousness, whereas processes done in our cortical regions are often within our conscious control, particularly the frontal lobes. And not only are the subcortical regions managing our internal body processes, but they're also specifically implicated in some of our more basic drives and emotional drive systems, things that, you know, have kept us safe evolutionarily. So these are largely understood to fall under 6 categories, you know: seeking being the most basic, the one getting out there into the world and looking for things, foraging in animals. But rage, fear, panic, lust, these are all instincts that have developed over evolutionary processes in order to protect us from danger. Care is associated with, a desire to look after our newborns, and these are emotional systems that are present in all mammals. And these, as I say, are sort of unconscious, automatic, and directed from our subcortical regions. And the reason I mention them is because our frontal lobes in particular are involved in the inhibition, the management of those basic impulses and drives. So, when we feel horny, when we feel angry, the reason we don't always immediately act on those instincts, unlike maybe the chimpanzees you've seen in a David Attenborough documentary, is because our frontal lobes are able to hold those feelings, look at them, step back, consider whether acting on them directly is going to be in our best instincts, and then either suppress or allow them to express themselves. And it is a pretty important skill that we have developed and become masters of over through evolution. That ability to regulate through inhibition our basic instincts is absolutely crucial. Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay. So where does that all leave us? What are therefore the common symptoms that might occur if there is damage to the frontal lobes? I'm going to leave aside the motor difficulties and the language problems and focus particularly on executive difficulties. So difficulty focusing or concentrating, so that inability to filter the information that is coming in through our senses and stay targeted on whatever particular thing we are doing at that time can become difficult. It can be, for example, become very difficult to follow the plot in a movie, to follow the story in a soap opera. As alluded to in my last slide, impulse control, this can be a particular issue. People end up saying exactly what they think, without consideration of the social circumstances at the time. Similarly, their emotions become more difficult to manage, can often become very angry very quickly or very upset very quickly. Mood swings are more pronounced than would otherwise have been the case. Obviously, we can expect the ability to make decisions and solve problems when we're unable to organize that information, unable to project back in time and into the future. Often makes it, almost impossible for people to plan or problem solve relatively simple tasks, which has implications for all areas of our life. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think social interactions, our social rules and norms are incredibly complicated. We all actually take them all for granted because we've grown up and become automatically understanding of how to behave in certain circumstances, when in fact those rules are a bit weird and a bit strange and don't really make sense. And when you lose the ability to step back and look at what's going on, take other people's perspective, see things from a different person's point of view, which is, often a key feature of executive problems, then social communication, social interaction can become very problematic and difficult. Initiation, so sort of the reverse to inhibition. There are, a group of people with specific lesions to particular parts of the prefrontal cortex who will literally struggle to initiate themselves. It's quite common in later stages of Alzheimer's, you might find that, but also in some presentations of brain injury. But people are not automatically, we might think somebody is depressed because they're not doing something. Psychologists will tend to look in that direction first, but you will find people who are not depressed. They just lack any drive to do anything and will be quite comfortably and happily just sit on the sofa the whole day or do very little beyond stereotyped behaviors that they've practiced over and over. It can be a particularly challenging difficulty to support in rehabilitation. What people might often talk about is that people's personalities become more exaggerated. Whoever they were before, they are more of that now. Maybe, whether they people who have struggled with anger in the past may find it really difficult in these circumstances. People who have been very emotionally labile in the past, again, may become even more so. So that's sort of a coarsening, an exaggeration of that pre-injury personality. And then, insight is difficult for most of us. We see the world through our own eyes, and when we change, it is hard to see how we have changed. And that is a problem, that self-awareness, that ability to see any changes, that insight into problems is particularly acute with executive functioning problems. Now, it's important to say not everybody will have all of these problems when they have a frontal lobe injury. They are independently variable. So the constellation of problems people present with will be different for everybody. So what are the consequences? I guess it's quite important to mention here that these executive problems, they're not like a broken arm. They're not like they're not even like somebody with a very poor memory. People with just executive problems can often talk coherently. They can often be very convincing. And those problems are often quite subtle. They may not even show up on the testing people like myself like to do to try and pick apart what's going on. But that doesn't mean they're not still completely life and relationship changing. Executive difficulties in particular are, a hidden disability, and, are difficult for people who aren't around the people dealing with these problems. They're often difficult for other people to see. And I think any professionals out there might understand, particularly with statutory service, who have particular tick lists of difficulties and the funding thresholds that people need to reach. We'll find categorizing this very profound disabilities within the usual measures. Even for myself, as somebody who's worked for 17 years in traumatic brain injury with people with executive problems, I have a client at the moment who I was, absolutely convinced would be able to manage his money after, 5 years of working together. And then, over the course of the last year, with the addition of the intense emotions provoked by a romantic relationship, it actually became quite clear that, under certain circumstances, that person wouldn't be able to manage their own finances, even though, I was absolutely convinced he could. And that brings me on to sort of a term that we often use called the frontal lobe paradox. This is where, an individual gives a good verbal account of themselves, can be incredibly convincing, but in the moment, under pressure, are unable to follow through with what they say they can do. And this is incredibly important, and as I say, one of the reasons why this is considered a bit of a hidden disability. So often these difficulties will make it very difficult to hold down a job, particularly due to the disorganization people experience. it can often have very profound impact on relationships. People's personalities have changed, right? The person who you knew before is now distinctly different from the person you might have known before, and that can lead to feelings of unresolved grief, guilt that you're grieving the loss of the person before, because they are still here, still with you, and are still functioning. But complicated feelings and complicated emotions are very common. Managing day-to-day decisions, budgetary decisions, these are all common experiences after brain injury, both for the individual and for the family and networks around. It's got an example here of a man, age 35, had a motorbike accident previously. Married with 2 young children, very gregarious, fun-loving, a man of his time, strict, but a sort of quintessential Englishman working in an office-based role. Had a motorbike accident, was unconscious for a couple of hours, presented with some agitated behaviour, but no significant physical injuries, good speech, and was quickly up and about and discharged. However, on moving back in with his family, he very quickly quit his job and then embarked on a pretty peripatetic lifestyle, moving his family sort of 7 times over the next year around the country, starting different business ventures which would ultimately fail. Anger, physical violence increased, some sexual disinhibition, a man who was a very traditional conservative man started flirting with his daughter's friends or customers in one of the shops that they owned. And tragically, some years later, ended up dying by suicide by driving off a cliff. This man wasn't diagnosed with a brain injury, but certainly, has all the hallmarks of dysexecutive problems. And actually, it was only through my job and talking to my family about the people I work with and their experiences that this person, who is actually my grandfather, my mother was one day able to make the link that actually maybe the reason for all of his behavior, all of his strange behavior, was this motorbike accident that he had. And the consequent trauma that caused in that family's life, even though it couldn't change what happened, I think a little bit of knowledge about brain injury and frontal lobe difficulties, has, I think, been therapeutic for my mother, and helped her make sense of what happened in the past. So that's just a personal reflection there. And that's why I think, actually attending a short talk like this, even for 30 minutes, can give enough, information that can allow people to start making links, maybe about people, friends, or family, which might put into better context some of the difficulties people have experienced. In terms of strategies, so routine chunking information apps are, in particular, I think are very helpful these days. Stop and think, zoom in, zoom out. Each of these strategies takes a long time to learn. It requires engagement in the process. It requires repetition, and ideally over an extended period of time with a professional rehabilitation team. So I don't want to get into too much detail about it now, but these are all compensatory strategies, point is they take a significant amount of time, and if you can access resources, ideally through professionals, because it's a lot to ask for individuals, I think, to do this on their own. I know there are groups out there. Certainly, Headway Essex has a cognitive rehabilitation group. I'm sure there are other services out there who can provide that support. So yes, I guess these are strategies that you can try yourself, but I think they're best done with the support of other people. And that finally brings me to, yes, the support system around the individual. You know, emotional adjustment to a brain injury, is a lifelong journey, actually. And it's not just a lifelong journey for the individual, it's also a lifelong journey for the friends and families around them. Accessing Headway, which obviously everybody on this call today, time has run out. Everybody on this call today has done is a fantastic first step. And I would definitely recommend going out there and finding other support groups, other people who are able to share and talk about your problems, either as a survivor or as a family member. And having time for your own self-care, for the family member self-care, away from the intensity of the ongoing rehabilitation and process is absolutely vital too. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now. I've been wittering on for long enough, and just thank you for everybody who's still here.